Today on The State of Us, NATO is running low on weapons for Ukraine, and the European Union is hitting a snag on a deal to cap the price of Russian oil. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, today by the one and only, your friendly redneck liberal and the senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance Jackson. Today, we're looking at a number of updates, both for NATO, Europe, the United States, and, of course, Ukraine and Russia's war. But actually, a lot of what we're talking about today is not necessarily specific to Russia. It's more specific to what's going on the other side of this effort. So we've got a lot of details and different items to look at, but we're going to start by talking about the arming of Ukraine because, we've heard, Lance, right, a lot about all these people sending weapons to Ukraine, but those weapon supplies aren't just unlimited. And NATO maybe wasn't necessarily expecting a land war. So the West has not saved possibly as much artillery as it should have, according to a recent article in the New York Times.
Who should we laud with this activity that is going on? Who's doing a good job? Who's stepping up and providing? Because the article talks about some of the smaller countries in Europe have almost depleted their supply. And some of the larger countries have given about 10% of their supply. So there are some countries that have given Ukraine almost everything that they have to try to do. And other countries who are like, yeah, we've given you some and we're going to hold back because we need this stuff because there's an overall shortage out there. We are not replenishing the supply of NATO and the United States with what the Ukrainians are using. So we are in a net negative as far as weapons. And then there's another part of the article that talks about, and I wonder what you think about this, that there are certain items we don't want to give to Ukraine because there's still the fear of
the Ukraine escalation component
going out and saying, you know what, we're really upset with the Russians for what they did to our country. So we're going to blast Russian territory, which if you're the Ukrainians, I don't necessarily know if I blame them for feeling that way, but there's the fear of the West and France and Germany that that's not the way to operate. That's not the way to go. So it's kind of a twofold situation. There seems to be
There are other weapons we could give them.
Right.
But the weapons we're willing to give them, there's shortages.
We're running in short supply, yes, without any kind of plan to resupply those weapons.
To put in perspective the severity of the situation, last summer in the Donbass region, the Ukrainians were firing 6,000 to 7,000 artillery rounds each day, according to senior NATO officials. The Russians were firing 40,000 to 50,000 rounds a day. By comparison, the United States produces only about 15,000 rounds each month.
Right. So, 6,000 or 7,000 rounds a day equates to roughly 175,000 to 200,000 rounds a month. And the U.S. is producing 15,000.
And part of the reason is, why have we even gotten to this place? Well, keep in mind that, back when, because you think about, it's like we've been in other wars where we've used artillery. One of the challenges is that we've not seen this level of artillery usage since the last World War. So even if you look at all of the other conflicts that have taken place, none of them come close to the amount of artillery being used by Russia and Ukraine. And there's just not been that much on hand for anybody because why would they need to? Russia arguably had, probably one of the biggest, if not the largest stockpile. And a lot of that's, when we say stockpile, it's old, outdated stuff that's not necessarily as accurate as you might want it to be, but they have it. So they're using it,
Well, like President Zelenskyy said, though, the Russians just are practicing terrorism. So you don't need to be accurate if you're just trying to terrorize. I mean, you're just launching missiles and hitting schools, hospitals, buildings. You're just firing them just to cause people to panic. You don't necessarily need the accuracy. The other side of this too, folks, is don't forget, while we've been focusing on Ukraine, and rightfully so, pick up your local newspaper or type in activity in North Korea and see what they've been doing lately, what nuclear testing and missile launches they've been doing over the last 6 months. And never forget what's happening in the Middle East, where all this oil is that everybody needs to stay warm this winter. So there are other regions in the world where weapons might be needed. No, they're not needed right now. But if you go and give your entire supply to Ukraine, and then an outbreak of violence starts somewhere else, what do you go with to that area to fight?
And something is more likely to break out,
right,
if they think there's less chance that you can get involved.
That's my point. Who's going to trust that crazy man in North Korea as he's watching what's happening in Ukraine saying, hey, I could probably attack South Korea right now because the United States is busy with Ukraine. And I know Russia and China to the north of me are going to look the other way. So I'm going to invade and take over South Korea, something that I've wanted to do forever and my family's wanted to do, since the 1950s when we tried to do it. Now's a good time because the United States is busy, and I'm reading about how their weapons are depleted. So now all of a sudden we've got...
And their allies' weapons are depleted.
So, exactly the point I was trying to make when you said that. It's like, it's a tough situation. There's something in there, though, that I told you.
Yes.
That I read that I don't understand. At the end of the article, it says, and this was a munitions person talking, saying, well, we could increase the amount we're making, but to make a 155-pound shell,
155 millimeter, right?
Millimeter, right? Yeah. I am not a weapons guy.
You're not a weapons expert.
No, I will admit that because I don't like blowing things up and killing people. I mean, I just don't think that's the way I want to do things. But if that's necessary, so those 155 millimeter shells, it's going to take like 4 or 5 years before we see them come off the line to where they'd be able to help. Somebody got to explain that to me because I'm not very smart. You mean it takes 4 to 5 years to make a shell? I mean, we're making 15,000 a month.
Right.
So obviously it doesn't take 4 or 5 years.
Right.
Now, so, I mean, are they, and I'm not totally stupid, but I mean, I'm not real smart.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're saying, well, to increase and we got to open up more lines. We have to hire people.
Right. We can't just do it with the existing. It's not like we can just say tomorrow, hey, this line, instead of cranking out 15,000 a month, is now going to crank out 100,000. Like, you can't do that because it's not set up for that.
And this is the United States, though, right? We were the arsenal for the world. Yeah, I was going to
say, we say that a lot, but what did we also do?
I mean, when the chips were down, we came up with a plan to get it done.
Yeah.
So are we saying, well, we feel really bad, but nah, we don't feel that bad.
It's right.
Because we could make it happen, but we're not going to.
Yeah. I think if we were in the situation that Ukraine is in, somehow I feel like we'd figure out
how to make those shells?
Right.
Yeah.
And faster than in 4 to 5 years. Somehow I don't think it would take that long to get it figured out.
And the point is, if you're going to be the police department for the world, then maybe that ought to take precedent because, you sure as hell aren't doing a heck of a lot with my tax money now that I'm seeing anything good out of. So, this would at least be something that might help somebody in another part of the world stand up to a gentleman that everybody who listens to these airways knows that I don't like.
The other thing you want to talk about that's kind of a frustration is you might say, well, why does it have to be 155 millimeter shells? Well, because that's the NATO standard. And the problem with that is that NATO might invest in old factories in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Bulgaria, but those would restart manufacturing of Soviet caliber 152 millimeter and 122 millimeter shells, which would be okay because Ukraine actually still has a lot of Soviet era artillery. So but see, here's this, this thing, right, about it. The article actually says, this is what they compare it to, right? That NATO countries, often with great fanfare, have provided Ukraine some advanced Western artillery, which uses NATO standard 155 millimeter shells. But NATO systems are rarely certified to use rounds that are produced by other NATO countries, which often make the shells differently. That is a way for arms manufacturers to ensure that they can sell ammunition for their guns the way that printer manufacturers make their money on ink cartridges. So in other words, Lance, the reason that we have this problem is because everybody got to make their piece.
Right.
Everybody got to get their money.
Right.
We don't make any money on the gun, but we make the money selling the munition. And heaven forbid that anybody else be able to make it, because then we wouldn't get our money. So 4 to 5 years is the answer. Because in order for you to get your certified artillery shells with their, 5-year warranty and everything and guaranteed accuracy.
Well, and even though the Ukrainians are firing a lot of missiles, to your point, they're getting about 4 to 5 times that fired back at them.
In Afghanistan, NATO collectively was firing maybe 300 rounds a day. Maybe 300 rounds a day. Ukraine, 6,000 to 7,000, Russia 40,000 to 50,000 a day. So, I mean, not even in the same realm. So that's why if you're sitting there wondering, well, why are we only producing 15,000 a month? Because that seems like, given the amount that's being fired, that's nuts. Well, we were using 300 a day, so 15,000 a month was more than...
We were producing twice as much as what we were using.
Right. So it's not like it was not like, we're stupid. How do we not, we didn't need, there was no reason to have this amount of artillery. Now you could say that the oversight was that military experts felt like there would never again be, a traditional ground conflict like this. And I mean, not just military experts. I think if you had asked, me, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, do you think that it's likely that there will be a major traditional ground war take place sometime soon in Europe? Probably not, right? I mean, that didn't seem incredibly likely. There's shortages on the weapons we're willing to provide. So what about the weapons that we're not willing to provide? Well, we're going to talk about that. Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. In total, NATO countries have so far provided some $40 billion in weaponry to Ukraine, roughly the size of France's annual defense budget. So one thing to understand is, yes, a lot of money is being spent, right? Yes, we're supplying a lot of stuff. At the same time, as we talked about before we went to break, there's a lot of things that we're not providing for. Why, Lance? Why are we not providing these things? Fear of escalation.
The greatest one is that itself, because the things that the Ukrainians want would allow them to send missiles into Russian territory. And we don't want that to take place. What's interesting, though, is we've watched, and I like this reference because I like this TV show, and I guess it's out currently now in a remake, but the MacGyvering of the Ukrainian troops, that they are very good at figuring out how to do what they want with what they've been given. One of the examples was there was a Russian ship that they wanted to sink, and they built rafts and put the artillery guns on the rafts and floated the rafts out close enough to be able to sink the ship. So they didn't have shells. We won't provide them for shells that would reach the ships because we don't want them to blow up the ships. But the Ukrainians said, well, you know what? We could build a floatable piece
and move this out
and
there.
move that out there to where the guns are within range, and then we'll blow up the ship. And it worked. I mean, I don't like, war is not my favorite thing, but I do like the ingenuity of, oh, okay, well, and then you could use that as an argument that
isn't this a moot point?
Why not go ahead and give it to them? Because if they want to do it, there's example after example, as stated in this article, of the Ukrainian military finding a way to get it done, or the Ukrainian soldier. So I don't know. I mean, just because somebody's doing something you don't want, do you make it easier for them to do it, though? There's that argument as well.
The Ukrainians want at least 4 systems that the West has not yet provided. And
now, here's the biggest one that I don't understand. Sorry, I'm getting these random thoughts in my head.
Okay.
You started to bring it up, and I'm sorry I interrupted. But the one I don't understand we don't give them is missile defense.
Yeah.
Why aren't we going to? They want a missile defense system. And you just told us in the article, it says that the Russians were deploying 40 to 50,000 missiles a day on Ukraine. And we know in what came out last weekend from President Zelenskyy that they're not accurate, and they're just raining terror down on areas that the Russians are just raining terror down on the regions that they've retreated from. Because we lost this land, so now we're just going to blow it all up. Well, why not give them a missile defense system so that they could stop some of that from happening? That doesn't make sense to me. I understand why you don't want to give them weapons that they could fire into Russia. You don't want to escalate the war. I got that. But why can't you give them a missile defense system to stop some of the missiles from blowing up innocent people who weren't involved in the war just because the Russians are mad because they lost the region? And I know that's all from the, quote, winner's perspective, but I mean, the Russians did control the land and they retreated from it. And now they're blowing it up. I mean, they weren't blowing it up when they had control over it, so why not? I don't understand the rationale to not give the Ukrainian army the pieces they need to protect themselves from a Russian attack. I mean, that's not escalating the war.
Right. Well, I think that part of it is if you look at the 4 things they're asking for, right? They want a surface-to-surface missile system that has longer range. That one is the most obvious in terms of, okay, if you give them something, right, that has 150-mile range to it, obviously now you're talking about long range, deployment here of missiles. But the other things they want, right, are Western fighter jets. They want Western tanks, and they want a lot more advanced air defense. So it's not that we haven't given any, it's that what we've given them is either old or outdated or not as good, because.
But the first 3 make sense to me. You don't want to give them more good weapons because they could, just because they're so upset with the Russians for doing this in the first place, take them and roll them across the Russian border.
Yeah, but at the same time, because you brought that up in the first segment, and I guess the place my mind goes immediately is the Ukrainians clearly have not been stupid in this conflict. I mean, they've done a pretty good job given the restrictions that have been placed on them and the obstacles to overcome. How do they rationalize? How do they think that's going to end? You know what I mean? You are giving, if they cross into Russian territory, they are giving Russia exactly what Russia wants, which is an excuse to use the weapons that Russia has not yet used. How do we think that Ukraine is going to arrive at the conclusion that because I now have this stuff, I will now do what I was not going to do before, which is offensively strike Russia, which again, I don't know how somebody sitting, advising President Zelenskyy could honestly say that that is a good idea in any shape or form. Because even if you're winning, right? Even if you push them out and you say, oh, we're going to show them not to do it to us again. Russia has nuclear weapons and you don't, We've talked about the whole time that there's a risk that they get mad enough just with the Ukraine conflict to use them, let alone if you attack Russia directly. I mean, it's just crazy to me that somebody would think that hey, we've pushed them out. Now the thing to do is we're going to invade Russia.
Yeah, but you're a student of history.
I know.
You know,
People
leaders
have done
dumb things like that before.
I know.
Because they thought it was a good idea.
But the thing is,
or they let their emotions take.
If that's going to happen, then I'm not sure that whether or not they have the systems is going to be the thing that makes the difference. You know what I mean? There's nothing that stops them right now from marching over the Russian border and saying, you know, hey, we're going to fight you. And yeah, they have their short range systems that we just talked about how they modified those and said, well, we'll just carry them over the border and then we'll strike you there.
And Western fighter jets.
You might be more emboldened.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. But again, I don't know. I guess I feel like if you're going to get to that state, they may do that anyway. Because they're mad.
But why encourage it?
Yeah.
Why make it easier? Why make it easier for them to do it?
Yeah.
I guess, and again, there maybe is a much more complicated reason than that.
Sure.
But that's all I've got for you is, you know.
It's like we have this, we've dipped our toe in with the trust on Ukraine.
Oh, all the way.
You know, it's just like, we kind of trust you. We trust you enough to give you certain things, but we don't trust you enough to give you these other things. And the thing that gets me about that is it costs money and it costs lives to drag it out, you know?
Well, and we're not going to go into this today, but you know from personal experience, there are American troops in the region.
Right.
I mean, not in Ukraine.
Right, yeah, not in Ukraine.
But in the countries
that we know of.
Right. In the NATO countries surrounding Ukraine, there are U.S. troops that are supporting Ukraine. So we've already put our soldiers in harm's way. I mean, that's a fact.
Sure.
Not a lot. But
we've already identified that, I mean, Ukraine accidentally hit a NATO ally, not intentionally,
right.
You know.
In Poland.
Right, trying to defend themselves. And that was somebody that wasn't trying to, you know, and not that Russia would try to either, but it's like Russia's firing how many times as many artillery every day and missiles than Ukraine. So
and a stray one.
I mean, you know, it's definitely not unconceivable to think that at some point.
And as we've all read, the Russians are bringing in more and more untrained troops.
Right.
To get more boots on the ground.
Yep.
And so, you know, I mean, and there's been an interesting response there, right? And again, this is the Western media, but they've talked about how the number of young Russian families who are on the borders of Russia looking to get out because they don't want to be part of the war.
The last thing on the weapon front is that one thing that we are pushing, you know, because we give a lot of credit to Ukraine, and I think we should. Don't get me wrong at all there. One thing is, though, that Washington has been a little bit critical of is that, you know, they're trying to get Ukraine to also be frugal about they shouldn't use a $150,000 missile system to bring down a $20,000 drone, right? There's an incongruency there of that's not a good expenditure of resources because it costs, you know, it's not, our money's not unlimited, right? And we want to fund you, but also we want to see that you use what we give you sensibly. And we don't have a lot of $150,000 missiles, so don't shoot down $20,000 drones with those missiles. You know, save those for the things that only they can shoot down, right? There's other things that can shoot down the $20,000 drone, so use those, not this. Let's save it for the things that it specially can do. So that's important too, is just being more selective with, which will help Ukraine too. I mean, it's not just help us spend less money. It's, hey, you're running out of certain things, so let's not use those things unless we have to. Let's switch to these other things that are more available and more plentiful that you can use 90% of the time.
It's a real interesting scenario, but you know what? It's cold outside. And remember when this all started, at least I do, back in February, the real concern was what happens when winter comes and the Russian oil is either way, way expensive or it dries up.
Because there are weapons like tanks and missiles, the things we've been talking about, but there's also weapons like you're not going to heat your citizens' homes kind of thing.
Or run your factories and have jobs
right.
and no money and inflation and destroy your economy because we're not going to give you oil. Yeah, we can fight you that way.
Yeah, let's talk about the energy though, because that's a big one, right? I mean, all of this is contingent upon, hey, NATO's running out of this stuff. We're trying to supply more to you, but does that change if the supply of oil changes? Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. There's not always a lot of good news in this war that Ukraine is in, that Russia started. But one piece of potentially decent news is that a relatively warm fall in Europe has led to them having either filled or nearly filled their reserves for winter of the oil and gas that they need. So that is a very positive thing, because a big concern, which Lance had mentioned at the end of the last segment, is what happens when winter comes. The other mitigating factor, though, right, are two big things. Great that the reserves are full, but the reserves don't guarantee that you're going to make it through winter, because if there's a particularly bad cold snap, right, well, the reserves can't take that into account. So that could be a big problem. And then the other side of, and this was an article as well, potential, what does Russia do, right? One of those things is pipeline sabotage as well. Or sabotage of the storage facilities.
Right. Or sabotage prices and just make it more and more expensive to, resupply your backup.
Because the EU is trying to set a price cap, right? But they're hung up there, and they haven't got that.
They
done
can't
yet.
get along with themselves. They can't decide, because according to the article, Russia's selling oil at about $56 a barrel, and they want to set the cap at $60 to $70. Some of the bigger countries in the EU. And people are arguing, well, that doesn't do any good. Putin, if he's selling it for 56 right now and can fund the war, and you cap him at 60 or 70, he's still going to be making enough money to keep fighting. Yes, it saves you money to, as far as not wrecking your economy. And that's only if Putin goes along with it. Just because the EU sets a price cap doesn't mean the Russians are going to say, yeah, we won't charge you more than that. He can charge whatever he wants to charge. And some of the other countries in the EU say, no, let's set the cap at like 30. So now we hurt Putin in the pocketbook. But then the question becomes, where do you get the energy that you need if Putin says, I'm not going to sell it to you for that? And your point is, well, they're getting a lot of it out in the water, or they have it stored out in the water, or they are building things that will receive oil out in the water from the United States or someplace else to resupply themselves. And then there's this whole sabotage piece, who says that they don't blow, the Russians don't blow some of that up to wreck the economy of Europe, to keep this war going, or to turn this war into their favor. And all of this with the backdrop of the OPEC countries just coming out and saying, yeah, we're going to cut production by 2 million barrels a day. I mean, there's a lot of moving pieces in this whole what's going to happen to the economy and to the heating oil for the individual home in the EU this winter. There's a lot of different pieces, and I'm sure you would agree, the more pieces there are that have to fall into place for something to work, the less likely it's going to work in your favor.
Right.
There's too many things that could go wrong that could affect you negatively.
Right.
You don't like to have, well, if this piece holds out, and then that'll make it easier for this piece to hold out. And then, you don't want that domino effect.
Because if any one of those things fails, then you have this catastrophic, crippling effect that is likely felt, right, not just in the place that's immediately affected, but the domino theory then of two. Europe, right, especially the European Union's heavily interconnected, not just from like a people standpoint, but right, an economic standpoint. Even places like the UK, which right is not in the European Union,
but they did that on purpose
anymore.
That's why there's a European Union.
Right.
There wasn't a European Union
when
I started teaching 40 years ago. they went together and said, you know what, we can make better trade deals if we're the European Union than if we're Poland or France or Germany and making our own independent trade deals. So you could argue they put themselves in this own mess. You know, they put themselves in this mess.
It's like everything, right?
They saw the positive sides.
Cons. Yes.
They sold it to the people and to the governments as a positive.
Yeah.
But there is a downside.
Right.
And now we're in the midst of the downside.
Yep. Trying to get everybody on the same page can be tricky. Especially.
And then holding it all together.
Right. The other thing is that the EU, in order for it to be created, there's certain things where you have to have consent of everybody in order to do a thing. That's not always the case, but a lot of time, like with what they're talking about, is you need the consent. Everybody has to agree to do it. Well, part of the problem is that everybody has to agree. If you just needed 2/3, they could probably get that right now, you know, but then it's that whole thing of the reason they didn't do that is because you get 2/3 and then somebody just refuses to listen. And what do you do?
Well, and the EU would never have been created in the first place if the bylaws had said you only needed 2/3.
Right.
Because the only reason they all came together is, we all have to agree.
Yeah.
And so the likelihood
it's the thing that it's the same problem, right? It's very similar that the United Nations has on the Security Council of the only way that you got, you know, Russia and France and the UK and the United States and who am I missing? The other permanent member, that was 4. China, there it is. Oh yeah, them. The only way that you got all those countries to agree to be part of it was that they all have a veto power so that if they don't like what's going to happen, they can just say, we're not doing that, you know?
The vote can be 219, and I'm not sure of the 219.
Yeah. But
it can be 219 to 1, and if you're one of the 5 permanent members.
Too bad.
Yeah. The other 219.
Right, doesn't matter.
Yeah, they lose.
So the point is that's how you got it set up. And that's the rules
you're playing under.
Right. That's
and so now we're going into winter, and it's like, okay, we've done everything we can during the summer to prepare to keep everybody warm and to keep the economy going. But I don't know if you want to take them in, you know, if there's an order or what, but, you know, you've got the possibility of sabotage. You've got the possibility of not coming up with a price cap that hurts Putin. And then you have the possibility of Putin saying, I don't care about no stinking price cap. If you want to buy oil from me, it's going to cost you this. And then you have those rogue governments who are part of the EU who say, you know what? I want to stay in power, so I have to keep my people warm. And they pay Putin's $90 or $100 a barrel that he's going to price gouge this winter so that they have energy, even though they agreed not to buy it. I mean,
right. Well, it is
so
that question of how
that,
much are you, and you being you and your country, willing to sacrifice
for the good of somebody else.
Right. And I mean, it makes it sound overly simplistic, but let's not be too critical of all of them too, because we're in a very different situation. You know, we're not next door to Russia. We don't need their oil, right? I mean, those things are not, there's allies that we have that care about that, but we don't need those things, right? Like, you're still now will gas go up? Yeah. But like, are you still going to be able to get gas? Yes. Is your home still going to get heated? Yes. Like, those things are going to happen regardless of whether or not Russia's selling oil to Europe.
There's a difference between having to pay more and not having it available.
Right. And not having it at all. Those are, they're very different, very different things. So I guess the point is that if we were in a similar situation, and historically we could point to plenty of instances where the U.S. has agreed to do something, and then the moment that it was a pain for us, we decided we're not going to do it anymore. So just to be totally fair, right, it's not like that's a very unreasonable thing. And the other thing is, if you're one of those countries, you may be like, we don't want Russian oil. And if you have to, if your pipes freeze in your house and they burst and you have no heat and, you can't keep your baby warm, like all of a sudden, freaking, I don't care where it comes from. Get me the heat, So there's a survival thing there too, not to oversimplify. It's not just a comfort thing. Some of these countries, like, you will die without heat. So it's not just like, I want to be warm. It's,
on the flip side, what if it's a relatively warm winter and they don't need the gas? So, but it's a crapshoot.
Right. It could be fine.
Right.
But we don't know. And that's the problem. Of they need to agree, because there needs to be something in place in the event that it's not.
Well, and with OPEC cutting the amount of oil it's making, the United States gets oil there, and we could take the oil we get from there and send it over to Europe. I mean, there are ways to divert, but things are stacking up against us to be able to help, because other countries are saying, well, we're not going to produce as much because we want to drive the price up so we make more money. And notice how they're doing it right at wintertime.
Convenient.
When the majority of, I shouldn't say, because it's now starting to be summer in the southern hemisphere. So they don't need it, but there are more people in the northern hemisphere than there are in the southern hemisphere. So, because it is winter in the southern half of the world, of the earth.
Well, you're right, Lance. I mean, in fact, just a little under 90% of the human population resides in the northern hemisphere of the globe, 87.4%, with the remainder residing in the southern. So yes, most of the world will be experiencing winter coming up / entering winter. Only a small fraction of the world is departing.
The population.
Winter. Right. The population. Yeah. Not geography, but the population of the world. Yes.
It's just, hopefully we've informed you, right? I don't have an answer here. I mean, I think.
Well, the answer is what you and I talked about before any of this crap even started, right? Which is, no, we can't go back and do what you and I think that we should have done before this all started, which was draw a red line in the sand, tell Russia you're not crossing this, and set American troops on the ground in Ukraine and say, don't come in here, because if you attack one of us, you're not only attacking Ukraine and the United States, you're also attacking NATO because you just attacked American forces, which you can't do. We didn't do that, but it's not too late to still do that. It's not too late to say, no, we can't trust you to take the weapon systems yourself, but we'll come in and show you how to use them. If Russia doesn't agree to the red line that we draw in the sand by putting people there and saying, you really want to do this, you can do this, but I think that'd be pretty stupid. So, I mean, that when you say, we don't have an answer based on
where we are now.
Right. Based on the way that everybody wants to do business right now, we don't have an answer under that scenario. We have an answer. It's just not the one it's not in the same framework that everybody else wants to use at the moment. So why do we have this show, Lance?
Well, because
there was a reason, right?
There's always a reason.
There's always.
And the main reason is that True Chat has a mission, and our mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And hopefully you're talking to your friends about this, and we've given you some insight that you hadn't read or hadn't seen before, and it enhances the conversations that you're having. And if they say, hey, we like this show, it sounds like it might be fun, might be something interesting to listen to, tell them that they can find us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and everywhere podcasts are found. And if you have an idea that we haven't thought of, or you have a thought for a show that we haven't done that you'd like us to do, email us at podcast@thestateofus.org.
The State of Us is a podcast that's released Tuesdays and Thursdays, first thing in the morning. Those same episodes are heard on our syndicated radio station partners, AM and FM radio, across the United States and parts of Canada. For The State of Us, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to producer Bradley Butch. Thank you, all our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.